Welcome to a new episode of the Creative Industry Insight podcast. I'm your host, Bobby. Today, we welcome sound designer Dillon Bennett, who joins us for our second episode covering Chicken Run, Dawn of the Nugget. Dillon will talk us through the process of creating the sound design in an animation film and the creative decisions that were made. Please be warned, there are heavy spoilers in this episode. Now let's jump into the conversation with Dillon. Hi Dillon, thank you for joining me today.
Thanks for having me.
We're here to talk about Chicken Run, Dawn of the Nuggets, which has just been released on Netflix. And yeah, I'm excited to talk about the sound design in an animation film. I've never had a sound designer on from the animation world. So I'm quite intrigued to see how different or how much of the same it is compared to live action, which I'm sure we'll dive straight into. But I guess we have to start off at the beginning. How did the project come about for you and what made you want to take it on?
So I'd previously worked with Steve Perkins, the editor, and Zoe Vieira Stunt, the producer, one of the producers, on a film called Frankenweenie, a Tim Burton film about 10 years ago. And we'd stayed in touch over the years, and they'd both gone off and done a huge amount of very successful films and had come back together and were working on Chicken Run, the sequel of Chicken Run. And so I contacted them and said, this is really exciting. It'd be great once you start thinking about sound to have a chance to chat to you about it. And so when they got into filming, they'd arranged a meeting with me and the director, Sam Fell, and I had a chat to Sam. After speaking to him and hearing about the plot and the scope and his vision, I was just really super excited to try and get to work on it. And obviously, Chicken Run, that the original Chicken Run was such a huge film, especially for British sort of industry and animation, that it was very exciting to be able to approach a sequel 25 years later, when there are so many more tools available for post sound and sound design and expectations and it'd be a real challenge. So yeah, I was very excited to try and work on it, and luckily me and Sam clicked on the meeting, and that's how it started.
It's crazy to think how long ago the first Chicken Run came out, and even still, like as you said, 25 years ago, and that's still to this day that people is still quite revered as an animation film. And then the idea that it's coming back after 25 years, and also the sort of how the themes have changed in terms of, like, in the first one you had Ginger sort of breaking out and having that sort of young, not young, the sort of not even energy, what's the word, the sort of like having the sort of guts to do certain things. And now in the second one, now that the people who probably watched the film 25 years ago are parents, you're sort of experiencing that, maybe that sort of parenthood as well, if you're of that age. But also on top of that, when you're saying about having worked with Steve, the editor and producer as well, keeping in touch, and then also sort of popping up again saying, oh, if you guys are working on this, we're happy to have a meeting as well, which probably helps as well, that when you have that working relationship, people know your shorthand and you know how each person works, and it sort of feels like a bit like the Blues Brothers, like we're getting the band back together.
Definitely. And there's a thing, you go through your career and there are certain people you work with and you just think, oh, I'd love to work with them again. You have a really good experience, and you just try and stay in touch and hope opportunities arise again and again. I think for me, having repeat work with certain editors, directors, producers that you really enjoy working with, and you know that you both push each other to do better and better work, is something that really drives me. I love to build these relationships so that you can sort of continue doing more and more ambitious projects as time goes on.
Do you ever find as well that, sometimes when you do build these relationships, that I guess in this case it was about 10 years ago that you worked with the crew, some of the crew before. But do you ever find sometimes when you think, oh, I wish I could work with them again, and then it takes ages just for everything to click again?
Definitely. I mean, this one was longer than usual. Like, I have a couple of directors that I work with more regularly, and that's nice to know that, when they have something coming up, they'll approach me and ask me about it, and then there are occasions like this where, especially with animation work, because it takes so long, you when you look at, so Sam is, probably one of the most successful stop motion animation directors, and he's been working for, I don't know, it's probably, I think he even did like a little bit of work on the original Chicken Run. He's been working in it for a long time, and he's only, I think he's done like sort of 4 or 5 movies, whereas in the space for other people, they can, do a few films in a year, or they can, or if you're a director in live action, you can still do a film every couple of years. So the whole process takes so long that for stop motion especially, but also animation, the period of time to be able to do work for the same people takes a lot longer.
Because if with live action, you're right, some people can do a film every year, which is crazy sort of output if you think about it, because you think you're really like pushing yourself to be just churning out films, and then also having that creative bug, shall we say, to keep going and keep pushing yourself to keep releasing films. But I guess, as you said, with animation, that they take so long, so there must be, as a director, and everybody around you as well, like there must be so much more patience and building and understanding where you want to go with your story and look and feel, and taking time with it. I think one of my questions as well, before I think we jump more into the project, is what is the difference in creating the sound design in an animation film compared to a live action film? Do you feel like you might have like more creativity about it, or do you have to have more restraint because so much time is taken in animation to create what you see on screen?
There's definitely a very big difference in the way you approach animation to live action for sound design. I mean, the best thing about animation is, there's just the opportunity to be so massively creative with every single sound. For both live action and animation, there are conventions which the audience expects. So, although in live action, most sounds you put in should be the real sounds of what you're going to hear, that's not always the case, like guns and fights and things like that. People want to hear this amplified version, the film version of a gun, or the film version of a fight or a car. But with animation dating back all the way to early cartoons, you would have sounds that weren't the real sounds, quite clearly weren't the real sounds used. And that has passed on over the years and grown to the point where you have a lot more flexibility of what you can actually use for a sound for an event. And then nowadays, some of the best sound designers in the world work not exclusively, but like a lot. They'll work in animation because they get that freedom to be as creative as possible, and the bar's really, really high. So it's a lot more precise in some ways, and you have to. There's a lot more detail in some ways as well. So the way that we approached the sound on Chicken Run, Dawn of the Nugget, is that every single sound that we were going to come up with, every piece of sound design, Foley, effects, had to be treated as it was going to be the lead sound. So it had to be very bold, full of character, upfront, to have a full frequency of kind of sound and be full of expression, to be fun. And then when it comes to the mix, you can choose which sounds you want to hear, where the eye is being directed, what Sam felt he wanted to hear in a scene, what fit in the space in terms of the sonic space, where there was gaps in the music, and it was that level of detail that sort of carried across the whole film. So for a live action film, there's quite often certain sounds you're just like, well, these ones, they can sound real. They don't have to be so full sounding. But with modern animation, you really do need to sort of put a lot more effort in, I think, for every single sound.
I think it's very interesting to hear how much more creativity and how much more thought needs to be made in terms of like the sound. So obviously with live action, if a car drives past, what that sort of sounds like due to every day. But I guess with the animation, when you're talking about how every sound needs to basically feel like that's going to be the main sound in the scene and actually have that unique feel to it, and guess reverberate between however audience members are watching it, if it's through screens, through a TV or on their headphones or at the cinema. I think since I've been doing this podcast, I've become more and more appreciative about how important sound is in film, even though you need everything else in terms of like the production design, cinematography, what's the editing. But then also, like, as audience members, you can forgive if something flickers on the screen because you're not sure if it's something to do with the projector or your TV might have cut out. But with sound, audiences become less forgiving, because if something's slightly off, then that's it. You're kind of taken out of the film and the world that's been created for you.
Definitely, there's sort of an appropriate sound, has that dual job of both being invisible so that no one thinks about the sound design, so it just makes what you're seeing feel real, but also sometimes has to kind of to draw the eye to help tell the story in a way that can't be necessarily done with the visual side, and that level of how much it should be real and sink into the sort of background unconscious of, or how much it should be pushed forward and told, you're hearing a sound that's specific to this thing, is always comes down to the moment and whether it sounds right in the mix. And then something that's also interesting about stop motion and animation especially, which is something that was actually brought up on Frankenweenie by Tim Burton to the supervisor of that film, the sound supervisor, Oliver Tarney. Tim Burton had said that he didn't want the sound to overtake the picture. And what he meant was that because stop motion is done, sometimes only 12 frames a second, sometimes it's 24 frames a second, but it has a certain quality and tactile nature to it, that and because it's not obviously realistic, that the sound shouldn't sound too real. It should still be appropriate. So for that example, we had recorded real footsteps on grass, and they just didn't really seem to fit the picture well. So we'd ended up using, I think it was tape, like cassette tape, instead of grass, and that actually sounded more like what it looked like in a weird way, even though it was very fake. We tried that and we were like, yeah, that works much better. And I think that's one of the things that is specific to stop motion, with animation as well in general, but specific to stop motion, is that there's a certain tactile character to the visuals that you need to also be aware of when you're doing the sound.
I think that's, again, like, that's the perfect way of just describing the movie magic, in terms of, you'd think it would sound like you're on actual grass, but you have to use a completely different, you use camera tape just to emphasize the sound on it. And I think that always, that sort of thing puts into my mind as well is like the when you see the sound design done for something like Terminator, where you see the Terminator's foot full on like go onto a skull, and when you actually see them in the booth recording it, it's like they're crushing a can, and it's like things like that. Obviously, they're not going to crush people's skulls for real in the sound booth, so they have to be a bit more creative on how they're going to on how it's going to be made. But it's the way that if you were to speak to like the average audience members, like how do you think they did this? They'll be completely wrong because they think it's natural for someone to walk on the grass when actually they were stepping on tape.
Yeah, yeah, exactly. And then we had a similar situation in Chicken Run where there's a scene when they're escaping from the factory and they're being shoved up by a ton of popcorn. And the popcorn's like all the kernels are popping, and it starts off with just a few, and then suddenly there's a rush of like millions of popcorn. And we'd recorded. I recorded so much popcorn. My son was very happy of how much popcorn I'd made that day. And we'd used a lot of real recordings of popcorn, but to actually emphasize the individual ones that you were seeing, to use real popcorn sounds just wasn't cutting through or satisfying enough. And Sam had suggested trying to do something that was like popcorn or had the same feeling as popcorn, but wasn't at all. So we tried like sort of little vocal pops or like water drips and things like that. And those are kind of like the lead sounds in that draw your eye. So when you're actually hearing it all going off, there's probably 1,000 real bits of popcorn popping, which are actually quite low in the mix compared to these tiny little plop, 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 plops, which are the ones which are popping through the most, which obviously on their own don't sound anything like popcorn, but in context sound even more popcorny than the rest.
Again, it's like that'll be something to note to listen to on a rewatch to see if you could hear that sound and what. Because if you close your eyes now that you know that information, it'll be something completely different rather than popcorn.
I hope so, yeah.
Which again, movie magic, incredible. But just to sort of get back on track with the film itself, you're mentioning that you sit down and speak to the director Sam, but you sit down with the director Sam and then you speak about your ideas. But where do you begin with your research, and how do you want to get those ideas across? Have you been given a brief on how the film should sound?
Yeah, so I mean, like when I approach a film, I love watching film in general, and I'll do a little bit of research beforehand. Obviously, before speaking to Sam, I rewatched the first Chicken Run and rewatched a couple of his other films that he'd done just to see what kind of sound he liked. But watching a lot of animation helps as well, and I'm a big fan of watching animation and listening out for the sound design. So I think trying to be aware of what other sound designers are doing at all times is a good way of just a general research. And then normally when I approach a film, I have quite good sort of intuition of how I think it should sound, what I would like to bring to a project. But Sam has a very, very strong idea of his, or had and has a very strong idea of his vision. So you have some directors that are quite happy to let the sound team run with what they think it should sound like, and then in temp mixes and things, then they'll have their opinion, and then some have a very, very specific idea. And I like working with both, but it's probably more enjoyable to work with someone where you're sometimes trying to find the sound that's in their head. It's more rewarding to try and please someone by them having a sound in their head and going, you know what, I know how to get that sound. And so Sam had a very sort of definite idea with themes and the general feel of the sound and the soundtrack. And it was to a certain degree following his instincts and then trying to match them or go above. So the process was that we had the first brief where he would talk through everything they were still yet to film, what they had filmed, and then he asked us for some key sequences and key sounds, to the ones which he thought were probably most challenging or the ones he wasn't sure about yet. We would give those to him, and then they would cut that into the edit, try things out, and then there was a little bit of sort of back and forth where we tried to refine and refine. And then during this process, you know, they were still filming. So as we got more finished actual filmed scenes, we would then start working on them. We'd pass them over to Steve. Steve would then have a listen, compare them to the sounds that he'd been putting in as temp cutting effects, and see, you know, if it was going in the right direction, if there was stuff that they still felt where the temp stuff they had was working better, they would keep that in, send it back, and then we'd go, okay, right, so they like these elements, but we need to work on these other parts. And it was like a nice sort of organic process where by the time we got to the mix, every sound had been approved. So normally with live action, you don't end up starting until they've already filmed it all and got everything in the can and done a first pass. With this, it was a nice process of getting to join just after they'd filmed the first third of the film, and then work through, and the brief kind of evolved with everything.
As a director, you'll probably have a certain way of thinking about how things will sound, especially in animation, and then collaborating with the sound team to think, okay, this is what I like, and then let's see what they can run with. That probably helped, you know, that having that experience in animation probably helps as well, knowing that obviously things aren't going to sound the same, but at least we can create a sound language that we're going to go with, and then see how much you can evolve as well during filming, especially when you say you've joined about a third of the way through. That probably makes your job slightly easier, knowing that by the time it gets to certain cuts and picture locks, that there won't be just that temp sound there to hold the film together, but you would actually have potential the final soundscapes in there, so that probably makes it easier for execs and producers and directors to make those final decisions before picture lock.
Definitely. I mean, it really helps. And I think also with something that has, where timing is so important, you know, comedy is definitely one of those areas where the timing of the cut and sound really, really do matter so much, that having that, the actual, essentially the final unmixed sound during the edit, and then being able to lock off the edit and go, yep, we're now good to go with that. It totally works, really helps. And I mean, just to go back to the sort of research and the brief, and one of the things that Sam was very keen on, like visually, the film is set in the 60s, and there are lots of references to old 60s shows and movies and things like that. And so the chicken factory, the base, has a certain look to it that has a very, it's like if you watch Joe 90, this old, what would you even call it? It was done by the Thunderbirds sort of team.
It's like puppets. I think I know what
Yeah,
you're talking about. Hold on. Yeah, puppets. They're like very similar to Captain Scarlet and Stingray.
exactly. Yeah.
Yeah, they weren't. Yeah, I think they were just puppets.
Yeah. So that there was this, Joe 90 was a big reference for Sam. He was like, he didn't just want it to look like that. He wanted it to kind of like sound like that. So I'd watched a couple of Joe 90 episodes, and like I swear, like some of the scenes, I was like, that's the exact same like look as you know, as Dr. Fry's base in Chicken Land. So Funland. So we had like these good references, sonic references that went with that Sam had in his head as well. It was like, I want it to sound like that as well as just looking like that. You know, it should have this 60s sci-fi kind of like synth element to it as well. So there was there was a lot of research that had to go into finding out what they made, how they made these sounds. And yeah, so that, there's the brief takes you on strange paths as you go through.
Do you know what? Joe 90 is the show that I have not heard of someone talk about it in years. So to hear that that was used as part of the research as well makes me smile and chuckle a little bit, because those, even though those shows like Captain Scarlet, Joe 90, and Stingray were so, quite very, very old, they were still quite a staple of my childhood. So it does make me smile a little bit knowing that that something like that is still being used as a jumping off point for research. And also it's just amazing to think as well, like the I know it's slightly going on a tangent, but even like if you think about the sound and how things are produced in that for its time is incredible as well, and like the craft that people have to create those sort of shows.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, and they're really ahead of their time with the stuff they were doing. You had like the BBC Radio Workshop and the sounds that they were making with these old 60s ARP synths and things. Crazy, that there's so and I mean, I think it's one of those things that for Sam it was very particular. It was like a, a childhood memory for him, and very British kind of childhood memory. So we really had to like find the actual right synths and the right sounds to go, right, is this the sound in your head? And he'd like, yeah, that's it, that's the one.
And I think as well, like the idea of finding synths and sounds, and the whole research process in, I guess, in filmmaking is like go watch other films. It's so different to sort of a normal day-to-day job if you had to do research. And I don't know, I also find that sort of idea of like, oh yeah, my research for today is to watch this film or to watch this TV show and figure out the idea that a director would like, and how to sort of capture that and bring it into the modern day setting.
Yeah.
Which is like, again, just yeah. I also shouts out to Joe 90. I think there's episodes of that on YouTube if anybody's ever interested in watching it.
It definitely is.
But I think we slightly touched upon this earlier regarding sounds and the creating like simple things. So for a film like this, you'll have chicken feet scuttering around or human characters walking around. And I think you touched upon it in Frankenweenie in terms of how you have to sort of adapt in creating the sound, so it wouldn't be actual someone walking on grass, as the example that you made. But how do you go about creating these simple things as chicken feet walking and human characters walking? Do you ever look at the designs as well, so that there's, for example, if a human's wearing Wellington boots, that there's going to be a certain sound of rubber hitting metal whilst they walk?
Yeah, so we have like, the Foley department will and do cover all of these things, and they'll give us the right, in a live action, they'll give us the right sounding shoes for the right sounding surface, and so on. Animation, as we talked about earlier, it can be a little bit different. And actually one of the early bits of sort of R&D work that we did at Sam's request was the chicken feet, because he was quite, I think he was more concerned because he wasn't quite sure how it should sound. And because it's a film with chickens constantly running around, it had to sound right without, otherwise it was just going to be a nightmare. So we did some tests and we collected a few clips of different scenes of chickens on different surfaces. And the Foley team recorded a few different examples for each one. We edited them together and sent them across. One of the things that we were quite aware of was that they're obviously not like real chicken feet. They don't have the claws and stuff like that. When you look at them, they're kind of a little bit floppy, and they have that kind of plasticine look to them. So one of the angles we went with was quite a rubbery sound. Another one was quite a floppy, like thwacky sound. And then the other one was just a more naturalistic kind of version. The Foley team built various props that would be the chicken feet. One was called the dino feet. I never actually saw them, but I can, in my head, I can imagine what the dino feet look like. And we sent those off, and it was the more naturalistic one we ended up going with, just because it just instantly felt right. You know, I think everyone that heard it was just like, yeah, that seems right. It didn't make too much of itself, and it sometimes I think everyone just has the same instinct.
I think as well, you're mentioning about how because you're working animation and the chickens are designed in a certain way, it'll be very different to how they would sound in real life. And you're mentioning about the claws, which actually didn't really come to my mind at the time, and thinking about that question until now, where you think they kind of obviously I'm doing this. This is audio, but I'm doing like my fingers as the claws, and how they'd kind of scutter around rather than just like a normal patter of sort of a flat foot for a chicken.
Yeah.
Um,
Another thing that also came up at the time was the scale of it, because even though most of the film we're actually with the chickens, so that they appear like the same size as the camera eye level is the same level, so that the feet would be big and all the sounds would be big. But when it's the scenes where they're with humans, you suddenly get the human point of view, and then they're tiny little chickens. So we had to do tracks of the chicken feet when they were these small little chickens in a room, and see if it still worked in that way. You know, and scale was like quite a big issue at first, or a concern. But yeah, the more naturalistic feet worked that just in the same way, really. It translated.
yeah, because I just think as well, like you're thinking about the normal day to day that somebody's going to be walking as a chicken, and that you're also thinking about the camera line of it all. And that's another really interesting point, is that where you have the camera as in for the eye line of a chicken, as audience members you're transported into that sort of that height. So then, as you're right, that their sound's going to be very different, and it'll be louder rather than smaller if you were taking it from the point of view of a human, for example.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, and scale is a funny thing, because you don't, you know, when they're holding a prop that's, say, like a pencil and it's the size of a giant spear for them, it should still have a pencily quality, even though it's not a small light thing. It's like a big wooden thing to them. So every kind of sound and prop really had to be questioned of, you know, the question had to be like, how does it still sound like the thing it is, but sized up to be relevant?
Isn't that such a like a funny detail that you need to take care of and really think about? Because you said about the sizing of it all, and I think that segues really nicely to my next question. Because when I was speaking to Mark and Theo whilst they were designing the sound on June, they were creating the sound of the thumper, which is they had to think about what came first in terms of the sound. Is that the thumper is a item that's been invented for the film, but then the thumping sound, how did that come about? So then they would have to think about how the thumper sound would need to sound different to a different kind of thumping to what the what was it, like the big, they're not snails, the sandworms,
Sandworms, yeah.
yeah, would be accustomed to. So when you have a film like Chicken Run, we have the big bass, we have the layer, we have certain things like when we have the montage about how they're going to break in. There's certain security features that come up when when you're designing the soundscape for different scenes and different areas. Are there things that you need to think about what would have come first in terms of sound, and then how do you adapt that sound to incorporate it into the design of the film?
So yeah, definitely like the approach. Sometimes you do have to think of how an event or an object would make the sound, like, you know, break it down into the individual parts. When it's a more complex sound like a vehicle or something, there are various elements that you need to be able to have separate to go, right, well, this is the engine, this is the physicality, so we have the squeaks and the balance of what makes the entirety work and how do all these individual parts work together are the sort of areas you need to sort of consider. Like quite often when I approach a film in itself in terms of sound, we tend to first see what we have already. So, we have like large libraries of sound effects and recordings we've done for previous jobs. And we see where the areas that we still need to sort of find sounds for. So there'll be, I'll first go through and go, we're pretty well covered for these areas and these areas, and then make a big list of things we need to find. And then we'll see if we need to track down individual sound libraries for those, or if we'll need to go and record specific things, and what props do we need to buy to record to get the sounds we're after. And then as we get into the detail of things, that's when we can start to elaborate on that more. For Chicken Run, we really wanted to record as much as we could to make everything as bespoke, so that we could make everything bold and full of character, and everything is fun and give as many variations for us for the edit. So generally the process starts off, what do we have and what do we need? And then when it comes to the actual individual sounds for animation, definitely it's kind of what would be a really fun take on this. So one of the examples would be that for the base, it being set in the 60s, and you had these robots and lots of different electronic machines and so on. I wanted to try and have some sort of synthy bleeps and blops that had as much character as possible, but also had a slightly nostalgic feel. So I'd heard some recording someone had done with an old Speak and Spell, which had been circuit bent to be as, so you can manipulate it and create these really strange sounds, but still sounded very much like that old early or sort of late 70s chip that they had in them. So I bought one of those and played around with it, and managed to get some really interesting sounds out that would fit certain areas in the film, and go, okay, right, so this is a nice, interesting sound that fits the dating of when this is meant to happen, but sounds that have a load of character to them, and maybe even a slight nostalgia thing that no one really could specifically say, oh, that's from this old toy, but it might trigger something that would make you think, oh, this is retro, but new, but retro.
Yeah, well, again, there's another funny thing when you go into sound and thinking about it, and how you're using certain synths or picking up old toys about how they would sound, and how I can imagine as well, like those sort of sounds, especially if it's a toy that maybe somebody played with or has an affiliation with, might spark something in their mind to be like, oh yeah, that sounds exactly like, I know this wasn't used because it's not that, but like a Pog Maker, for example. I don't know if anyone ever remembers using one of those, or it's just the idea of like certain things representing other things, and how creative you can be with sound to create those soundscapes for what's happening on screen.
Yeah, definitely. Like there was one particular, there's an area in the main base called the Funland, which is where the chickens are held captive. They're brainwashed. They're in this basically giant theme park, seemingly having the time of their lives, and there's rides everywhere, and in the temp sound effects that they had in the cutting copy, they just had like a Funland, a fun fair kind of sound. And Sam wanted it to sound like that, but also wanted it to sound like an old Pac-Man pinball machine, this very specific memory, childhood memory of a Pac-Man pinball machine. So I went and had a little bit of research, and it's actually like it's an odd combination of pinball, but it has these early like 8-bit kind of like bleeps and blops and melodies. And it was something about that combination of clunks and mechanisms and bells, but also with a bit of early digital synths that he wanted. So then, we would go in and we got some 8-bit synths, and we started making little melodies to go with that, and then we'd build up different machinery parts for each of the rides and the games, and give each of them their own character, so that wherever you were in that scene, you could say, oh, this machine is over to the left, this machine's over to your right, this one's behind you. And they built up like a soundscape that in the end kind of does sound a little bit like a Pac-Man pinball machine, but at the same time sounds like a fun fair.
I just like kind of listening to that answer with a smile on my face, just because it's the one, it's like the nostalgia of Sam using his nostalgia to create something that would remind him of something from his childhood. But there's also the layers that go into the sound as well, to your left, to your right, to the center, and then how that all merges into one, create that the final sound of it all. And then again, it's just so clever as well. And so also, it's so simple but clever at the same time in how it's sort of done and made, and how you as an audience member are supposed to feel over it all. But then also, what I'm curious to know about, because we've touched on one of my questions earlier about the creative freedom in the soundscape for audiences, about what they might have not heard. But I think you touched upon something else that I'd like to sort of pick up on again, and that's the comedic moments in the film. And there's obviously ways that comedy, you said it as well, comedy is all about timing. The lines have been delivered by the characters, the lines have been delivered by the actors, sorry, in a certain manner. And you probably see it on screen as well, a comedic moment. But when it comes to sound, how do you go about creating the sound cues to emphasize the comedy on screen? Then how do you not overdo it so it doesn't overshadow what's happening on screen as well?
I mean, that's the biggest thing with animation, especially with Aardman, I guess, Pixar as well, these kind of things, is that whenever there's an event that's a funny event, the sound needs to really complement it or push it as much as it can. And because you're given a lot more license with sound in animation, you can be very exaggerated. You don't have to be so realistic. So I've never listened to so many boings and twangs in my life as I did on I mean, I think I'd already had like quite a lot in my library, and I'd bought a couple of boing twang libraries specifically for the job, and then we'd recorded a load as well. I must have listened to 10,000 of them. But sometimes it is like you just need to find the right kind of track that will just sit right with something, not sound weird, and actually complement it. And to a certain degree, it kind of, for example, if there's like a scene where a tree thwacks and throws Rocky up over the fence, and so trying to get the right kind of wooden twang that feels like it could be a branch or a real actual branch swinging, and it's a combination of trial and error, getting the realistic elements with the exaggerated elements. We try rubber ones, metal ones. Sometimes the wrong sound can actually just fit perfectly well in combination. But everything really was approached with the idea that it needs to be fun and have a lot of character in it. So, for example, the trucks that they drive the chickens to the baddie base, they needed to sound fun as well. So they were very, very kind of like rattly and chuggy, even though that they were new fans, and they kind of blob along or bounce along in a really, really kind of fun way visually, and the sound needed to match that as well. Um, when you break it down into the individual parts, I think it's like a tractor that's used mainly for the engine, and then a squeaking box, and various other things. There's nothing actually from a van based in there, but quite often when you get the components right, it just fits the picture. And so we approached every sound with that in mind, to sort of go, what is the most fun way we can make this sound, and let's start off really silly and then work our way to something that fits.
Yeah, I guess when it comes to comedy as well, like he's pointing out, you don't want things to be overshadowed, and there's a way that about it. At the same time, you must have driven yourself crazy with all the boings and the bonks and the other clangs that comedic clangs that go with it all. I kind of want to ask how many like sound files there must be of all of those, but I'm kind of scared at the same time, just in case you say, yeah, I must have listened to about 1 million of them.
I'd say, yeah, I wouldn't be surprised if there's 10,000 twangs and boings I'd listen to, honestly.
Oh my gosh, oh your port is. But then again, then going from that and hearing something to what might sound necessary for the film as well, and building up from there, because it is you do have those visual elements, but then those sound element, comedic elements as well, will really emphasize facts for audience members to kind of laugh at what's happening. But I think also that sound, you'd think, oh, what's happened here? Oh yeah, okay. Or you can hear something breaking off screen, for example, as well, and that'll make you sort of chuckle in your seat. But then also when you point out the chicken truck as well, how again the sound of that, it does look like a new vehicle, but as you said, it's chugging along. It has that sort of, I think the best way to describe it is I always think of like the milk truck in Heartbeat. I don't know if you ever saw that show.
Yeah.
Again, massive throwback to British television. Must see watch as well on Sundays. That's what it kind of makes me think about as well. Once you started mentioning about the tractor and the sound, is that sort of old school vehicles, or they were new at the time, but there's something mechanically that's quite funny about it that it will spark a memory as well for you. In my case, Heartbeat.
Yeah, definitely. And I think going in hand with the nostalgia thing is that everything needed to sound like a not soft but warm, kind of like they didn't want anything harsh or sharp that you would get in an action film or a sci-fi film. It all had to be kind of a warm, nostalgic kind of feel to it, but sound modern. So so it was kind of like the quality of the sounds in themselves, as opposed to the quality of the recording, had to have that kind of nice rounded.
Yes, and I
Yeah,
I I do like that idea. Is like it feels like it's a bit of an oxymoron. I think that's the right word, where we want the nostalgia, but we want the modern feel at the same time. But you kind of understand what the brief would be from that, because it's the okay, you need to have the mixture of both, and then the same of what's being presented on screen, and the comedic element of it all. What I'm curious to know about as well is what I'm curious to know about as well, because when I spoke to Steve Perkins, the editor of the film, he was talking about how they essentially edited the film twice. So before they started shooting the film, they would basically shoot their own version of film and edit it and see what the pacing's like, what jokes are landing, and how it works. But I think you might have answered this question slightly earlier, but are you ever involved in the first steps of those filmmaking, or is it a case that I think you, as you mentioned before, you join in already a third of the way of the filming?
yeah. I mean, it's really nice to be able to join at that point. It's strange starting to watch the film for the first time, and there's most of it there, and then you get into the second act, and suddenly there's a couple of bits shot, but then it's mainly just storyboard, and then the last half of the film is all storyboard. It's a lot harder to imagine it all coming together for me anyway. I'm sure for people in other departments who are more used to that process, but it was nice to be able to work progressively with them and be able to provide them with sounds. Obviously, as you said, Steve, they were adding their own voices, temp voices for the crowds, and elements of the actors' performance that they still needed to update, and they were putting temp effects in. And then as we went through the process, we would send them bounces for specific scenes that they would put in, and then as time went on, it would be when it got broken into reels and they got closer to finishing the filming, then we'd be sending them whole reels of like, here's all of the backgrounds, here's all the effects, and then they would pass us back notes of like, oh, these things we'd quite like to change, these things we preferred the temp effects that we had, so can you come up with something more similar to that? And it's a nice process to be able to feel like you're working more in tangent. And as you said earlier, there's always that thing when you don't work that way and you almost work in isolation and then just turn up at a mix that someone, an exec producer will show up and go, I've not heard any of this and I don't like any of it. And or that they're very used to a certain temp sound that was in there. So to have had everything approved and worked on and refined before we even got to the mix was a huge benefit to us, because then it just came down to how do we make all of this work together in the best possible way. And the same happened with the music as well, you know, like the composer Harry was providing early demos as they were working through at the same time as we were providing the sound design. So everything was progressing in the same way. Steve was able to cut in a way that all three, music, visuals, and sound effects, could work together. And it even continued on until I think it was like the second last day of the mix, when there was one shot where you have a lot of the chickens, when they've been brainwashed, all marching along, and you've got a song playing and the marches and the song, and everything was kind of going in time except this one shot, which there was just a slip of something, and then we couldn't get it to work in the mix. And then Steve was like, started to say something, and I turned around and gone at the same time, do you think, both of us had the same idea. I was just like, do you think if we just cut that frame or slip that frame by, you know, a tiny bit, we'd be able to get it to work? And so he went away, did a quick edit, came back, and then it was seamless across there. So having that kind of like working relationship where you're all building at the same time really does make the process so much easier.
Yeah, and it must be so funny sort of watching the temp sound, the temp audio as well for characters' voices whilst watching the storyboards, especially if it's just like the crew members putting on voices or certain temp sounds that probably just been put in there as like just so that it's like an indication for what you guys need to work on. That must be quite funny to sort of see and then sort of build back from that as well.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, I have to say, like some people pay more attention or put more emphasis on the temp sound effects that they put in than others. And Steve and Sam definitely are very focused on how things should sound. So, you know, even though they may not have been the best sound effects that they had in there, the cutting up with every sound in there had like a reason. You know, it was like, oh, this one sounds like it has a certain dated quality to it that makes me think of the 60s, or this one has a certain character to it that we'd like to play because we think it's fun. So it's you're given a very good blueprint when you get a cutting copy like that really helps as you go through, and sometimes is a lot easier than simply being someone giving you a brief or explaining how they think it should sound, because it's quite often very hard to talk about sound in a way that can be passed from one to another. I mean, even sound designers find it quite hard to describe things to each other in a way that's without, you know, actually just copying the sound vocally. You know, that there's probably less language to describe sound as there is for other things.
I think it's one of those things as well that, like, because you can't see sound in terms of like a picture, yeah, you can't. How do you describe a car sound? And you think, well, you know what it sounds like, but then it's like, well, there's probably 1,000 different ways that a car could sound driving past. Or if there's an issue with a car, for example, or if they had a flat tire whilst they're driving, and so on and so forth. And I think as well, as you said, with the temp soundtrack or soundscape that they'll use, yeah, you'll probably be like, okay, I know what you're going for here. Let's get this idea and let's pump it with steroids and make an absolute beast for when the final edit comes in.
Yeah, definitely. And you know, one of the other things is that we have to think about not just the getting the sounds right themselves, but also kind of like the weight of the whole thing, because there's a lot of music in the film and the music's fantastic. And you want it to play loud, you want it to be driving everything along, but you also need to be able to hear everything that you need to hear in terms of the sound design. So every sound not only has to exist on its own as a fun, full of character sound, it also needs to be able to cut through and complement the music. So there's a lot of times having the cutting copy of the demo music is really handy, because you're like, oh, all of the 8-bit melodies in Funland had to be pitched to be just right to sort of sit with the music that was playing there, or a metal screech in like the car chase at the end had to kind of like sit just right, timing wise and frequency wise with the music. And it's always very hard when you get the music right at the end of the process, right? The mix, no one's heard it before, and suddenly you're like, well, now we have to change every single sound to try and make it work. Whereas if you've already had that blueprint there, you've already gone, okay, you know, I know that these beeps work well with this cue. And even though it's a demo, it's still going to have the same melody. It's still going to have the same sort of timing.
Yes, and also the fact that there are certain things that you have to take consideration as well, like frequency. Again, there's probably a massive big science behind that in terms of the pitches that people will be having in their ears listening to it, and you don't want the two to be fighting against one another when watching when the film is being played for audiences. I just want to sort of get to my penultimate question as well. What was the hardest scene to create the sound design for?
There's probably a few which were the most challenging for different reasons. The fun land for the complexity, which, as we talked about before, you know, all the different machines. That was probably the most complex scene, because it just involved a huge amount of work to get it to a place that sounded just kind of real, or believable, and also to tick that note of it sounding like the Pac-Man pinball machine that Sam had in his head. There's a brainwashing scene where Tweedy is brainwashing Ginger with her partner Dr. Fry's machine, which was the Joe 90s referenced one, and that was a very hard scene to get right in the mix, because the music was also doing a similar thing. So that was kind of one of those situations where the sound design had to almost become part of the music for that little moment or handover. So that was, but oddly enough, the hardest actual sound to get was, there's a cotton wool airship that Fowler and the rat flies. And this was the one sound that I think everyone on the sound team had a go at trying to make the sound. And it's basically an old fan driving it. And we'd each done recordings of fans and tried them and presented it to Sam and Steve, and Sam was like, no, it's still not right, you know. So one day I decided just to go out, went to a local shop, bought every type of small fan I could find, came back with like an armful of like 6 or 7 fans, got in the room with Sam, and it's just like, right, we're now going to get a load of mics up and just record every single one of them, and we'll see which one works the best and play with them and slow them down and stuff. And eventually got one that was just as the sound in his head, and it's like, that's the one there, that one. And so now I've got yeah, a studio full of fans and finally got that sound nailed.
Again, the extent that people would go through to create movie magic, and it's just, again, at least you'll be sorted for the summer when it's hot for that 1 week in next year in the UK.
Yeah,
But it's just, again, sitting down and going through fans and thinking about what's going to sound right. And there must be like, there must have been sort of moments where it's like, no, those two sound similar. Wait, go back to number 3. Wait, no, go back to number 7. Okay, wait, let's go back to this one. Where, again, probably was quite very time consuming and excruciating, but then very satisfying at the end.
definitely. Yeah. I mean, and also the problem we had with the fans is they made us a whirring tonal sound, which then when you add the music, you're suddenly like, well, that's just like, a clash of tones there. So we need to change the pitch and the movement of it. So it's almost like bending from one note to another that complements the music as it moves across the screen. And yeah, it was definitely quite a challenging but seemingly small detail that was one of the final things for us to actually get right.
Again, amazing how, like, as like audience member or somebody like myself, just thinking about, even though you have the sound of it, but you're saying like the tone and pitch and getting that right for people's ears and how it should sound correctly on screen. Yeah, even sort of little things like that and how important it is for your work to create that. And then just to hit you with my final question, what was your favorite scene to do the sound design for?
I think in retrospect, my favorite scene was the scene where Rocky is trying to break into Funland, because it was one of the earlier scenes I'd worked on. And it was a rare occasion of certain bits of equipment and tools and libraries and recordings I'd just done had all came together to, sometimes you just work on something and you're like, oh, that just really works well. And generally speaking, every scene gets refined and tweaked, and you say to someone else, oh, why don't you have a go at this and see what you come up with, and you'll have a few different variations on every sound. And that was one of the only scenes that basically didn't change from very, very early days right into the mix. And it was also one of the first scenes that I played for Sam and Steve, and just to see their faces light up when they first heard it, and they were just like, oh yeah, that's it, that's the sound we want for the film. So for me in particular, that scene kind of was the moment when I felt that we were all on the same page of like, right, this is how we each thought this is how the film should sound. And it has like a robot mole that pops up out the ground, and is just the timing of it, of all of the elements really work amazingly well. And there are plenty of other scenes in there which are great, and I'm very proud of, that were worked on by myself and the sound effects editors. But I think that one for me personally will always be my favorite.
It's a solid choice. I think as well, like the idea of the whole layers when you see it, it kind of has that old school James Bond film feel as well of how we're going to break into here. Then you have these little elements that pop up. But then also, as when you're saying as well, having that sound design created and having Sam and producers listen to it, and then knowing that you're all on the same page, that that you're sort of already firing on all cylinders. That must be sort of like a good sort of brush the dirt off your shoulders sort of moment of like, yeah, we're doing this. We've got this. We've got this under control.
Definitely, yeah. And it kind of, I think it was a little moment in the process that we all knew were on the right page. So there was kind of like, there's no worry from that moment onwards of like, do they need to explain better what they want from me, or do I need to try different things because I'm not getting what they want? And so yeah, from that moment onwards, we all kind of knew that we were going to get there, which was nice.
Yeah, and like again, that's a good feeling knowing that you're all on the same page. Because I think there's nothing worse than no one not saying anything. I'm sure they would, but at the same time, it's just having that confidence and knowing that you're doing well. It works out and it helps in the long run as well. Dillon, thank you so much for your time. Chicken Run Dawn of the Nugget is streaming now on Netflix. Go out, watch Dillon's work. Well, I say watch Dillon's work. Also keep an ear out for Dillon's work, should I say. And yeah, go out, watch it and enjoy it. Thank you again for your time, Dillon.
Thank you very much. It's a pleasure.
You take care and bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you for listening. Please subscribe, rate, and review this podcast.